This podcast is rated E for explicit.
All you want is my hunger. All you need is my pain. Nothing in between ever met you lost.
After the journey I've been on, I realize it's the journey itself that has been the best teacher. After reflecting on Leaving Neverland and the feelings it elicits for me, come some pertinent questions. How did my molester, who for many years I saw as a monster, become my friend? How do we deal with the duality of loving and hating the same thing? How do we accept reality without completely understanding the why? That sometimes the good guy and the bad guy is the same guy. So you made it to part 2. You're something special. Look at you. And if that's not you, don't you skip a thing. Before you listen to this, you need to listen to how 4 p.m. changed everything. But hey, Oprah's on, so let the show begin. You met me in the midst of many things. Shedding skin, sprout wings. Looking at life as a spiritual being through a human lens. Having conversations with God about so many things. This show is your invitation. The poet God is the conversation. Not everyone has the type of friends that would take this journey that Amon and Gary has taken with me. Listen, I understand that this is some heavy shit to talk about, and Leaving Neverland, although it is excellent, compelling storytelling, it is also very difficult to watch. So, thank you guys for taking this journey and helping me to tell this story. We pick up the conversation on how an Oprah show karaoke challenge led to a rebirth when I was 27 years old. Being validated on one of the loudest stages in the world,
right,
or platforms in the
empowering.
world, it's hard to kind of go back in a shell after that,
right?
You know, it's like, listen, I've been given permission to speak.
Right.
You're never going to silence me again.
Right. Because I think one of the things I've heard you talk about, you know, obviously off the record, was being born again, right? Kind of this rebirth.
Yeah.
It was like how do you describe it again?
I describe it as a rebirth.
Right.
And
is this kind of the timing of when this where does that fall in this timeline?
Well, the rebirth happened before the Oprah show thing came around.
Okay.
And I actually, as a matter of fact, if that didn't happen, I don't think I would have ended up on the show.
You don't think so that was like, that happened before you recorded the piece that ended up ultimately getting you on the Oprah's. Okay.
Because by that time, I was already on a journey to, kind of awakening, and so forth. And so that helped me where I was going, but I had already started.
Right.
To go there. And so it was part of it. I think I had to be in a space, a certain mindset in order for that to happen to me.
Yeah. And then also having Gary there to kind of push you, give you that little bit of a push to say, you need to do this.
Right.
And you immediately saying no. And then he's saying, looking at you again and saying, no, you need to do this.
Right.
Can you talk a little bit about like the original like maybe not exactly the moment necessarily, but some of the things that were could be considered like a catalyst for that rebirth, because it happened before these other incredible experiences that really, like, to your point, like, once you got up to that stage, like, you couldn't go back in that shell.
Right.
But in order to even get there's other catalysts to create this rebirth. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, that happened because of another Oprah show about where Oprah was doing something about it was a karaoke challenge that she was doing.
Huh. And man, Oprah's got some serious challenges. Maybe I need to go back in the archives.
And this was at a time when I wasn't doing anything on camera. I wasn't doing. I didn't do pictures. I didn't. I didn't want to see myself on camera. I didn't want to see myself. So I would to record a video of me singing a song was not something I was gonna do.
Right.
That wasn't something that I was gonna do. And so, as a matter of fact, Gary did encourage me to do that. I remember that, and I was like, I'm not doing that. I'm not sending no videos, and I'm not doing that. you know.
Yeah.
And so I remember, just being home one day, and I said, well, you know what? I'll do it, but I'll only do it for me. I'll do it and I'll watch it and then I'll delete it. That's because I knew I was going to hate it.
What was the song?
I don't remember the song.
All I want to do is win, win, win.
That was not the song.
Not for that one. But
okay. That's going to be a different episode. We'll talk about that one next time. Tune in, all right?
That was not the song. But I remember recording something and then watching it back and remember not completely hating it. And it was almost like, if you've ever hated yourself or have any self-image issues like I did, you look in the mirror and you just don't like what you see. You certainly don't want to see yourself on video.
Right.
Like that's the worst thing that you could do.
Right.
And so it was painful to look at the video, because for the most part, all I saw was somebody that I hated.
Right.
And so there was a moment though in that viewing that I saw something that I hadn't seen before, that I hadn't recognized before. And so it was enough. It was almost like it was enough of something that I wanted to find. It sparked something for me to dig deeper. And I was like, okay, there's something there. There's somebody behind that, whatever it is, and I need to find him. Mm-hmm. I need to find out what that is. And so I kept doing it for me. And I never sent any videos into the Oprah show for that. But I kept doing it for me because I was seeing myself in a different light the more I did it. And it was almost like each act of doing it was breaking this paradigm of
self-doubt.
Yeah, and everything that I had, all this negative stuff, it was almost like the act of doing what I was doing was tearing it down little bit by little bit. And it was almost like this spiritual experience that I was having.
Right.
And it transformed me. The act of doing it transformed me. It was transformative. Just me doing that and becoming whatever it was and seeing myself in a whole different light, literally.
Right.
Seeing myself in a whole different light. I was like, wow, this is something, I must be onto something. And I don't know why it's having this effect, but I could see that the more that I did it, I felt different.
Right.
And I felt like I had this, whatever this thing was, this lens that I was looking at myself through all these years was a lie.
Right. So this thing that you were seeing in these videos was really it was almost like seeing the genuine,
uncovering
who you are,
who
you always had been for the first time.
Right.
Let me ask you. So, like, right before or even during this process, you obviously had gone through a lot of years of watching Oprah and engaging with it and growing more and more from it. Were you also still kind of experiencing, these, whether it was reliving what happened to you or like kind of having these feelings of fear from these horrible experiences that you had, like thinking about these monsters and thinking about the power that they held over? Was that something that was still happening for you, or was that Were you at a point where you had it was not happening as much and maybe was not directly connected, or you may not have I don't know. I'm just like trying to understand where in the path those experiences were in your mindset and your kind of identity, I guess.
It kind of faded as the years went on. Like I lived in New York for 5 years after coming there when I was 11, and then I had moved to Texas and stayed for Texas in Texas for a much shorter time. But when I moved back to the Virgin Islands, and not wanting to move back, I had to confront some of the monsters, so to speak.
How old were you when you moved back?
I was 18, just about, and this was back in 1999, and I remember that time well because it was, about to be the year 2000, and all these predictions of what people were saying was going to happen and all that, and so that was around the time when I moved back, and I remember wanting to confront the bully that had molested me, and it was one of the first things.
Like the guy that was the teenager,
yes,
in the building, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
And it was one of the first things that I did when I got there, and so.
What was the driver for that? Did you want an answer of why he did what he did? Did you want an admission of guilt? Did you what? Do you have any idea of what was driving you to be like, the first thing I do when I get off that plane, I want to go talk to this guy? What was the goal? I mean, did you know?
I think it was that I wanted to understand why.
Why he chose you, or
just why the whole
anything?
thing,
Okay.
all of it.
Yeah.
And so I had a bunch of different questions. And so I remember finding him somewhere and telling him that I wanted to talk to him. And he agreed to have a conversation with me, and we went up on the this basketball court, and we sat down on one of the bleachers, and I asked him. I remember asking him if he had did it to anybody else. I think that was one of my first questions, because I remember hearing that it's never just one.
Right. From kind of your experience of listening to Oprah over the last 7 years at that point.
Yeah.
Had you had any contact with him from when you left?
No.
When you were 11 years old to when you got back?
Nope.
Found him and said, I need to talk to you?
No, all he knew that I didn't live there anymore.
What was his reaction when he first saw you? Was it like a surprise? Was it
I think he was very surprised.
Was it he was not happy to see you?
Well, he didn't. He was kind of surprised because I had been away for a while, many years, and the last time he saw me, I was 11.
Right.
So by this time we were, adults.
Right.
And so I think he was curious too about what in the world that I wanted to talk to him about. And so, but I didn't come at him in an aggressive way. It was like, hey, I want to talk to you. When are you available? And he was like, I guess we could talk. So
kind of like cautious, but not.
Yeah. Right.
Like he didn't see you and was just like, oh no, this is bad.
Right.
He just was like,
I think he was curious.
Just curious, like what is up with this guy? I haven't seen him in
and so
7 years or whatever.
I had heard that he did molest other people from somebody, one of my cousins who knew him and who lived on the island.
Right.
And so I was asking him questions, some of which I already knew the answer to.
Right.
And so, when I sat down, that was one of my first questions because I wanted to know if he would be able to admit that. And he wasn't able to admit that. He said that he didn't.
But was he at least able to admit that what you recall the experience being was the same that he recalled?
Yeah, he was able. He did. But he wasn't able to admit that he about anybody else. But as far as me is concerned, yeah. He did concede to that.
And in the immediate culture and society of the island, that time, or the community, at least that you remembered of it, what was the attitude towards stuff like that?
You don't talk about those things.
You just don't talk about those things. It was even if it was happening, it was like a completely out of bounds, not something you would even discuss.
Correct.
Which is, on the other side of the spectrum from what you experience in the United States. Maybe not necessarily, like, yes, definitely within that talk show that you had as a teenager, but also in open air conversations on the Oprah show, a nationally televised, channel medium, right?
Right.
So it's a very different cultural thing that you're going through. So you were in a very, what I would consider, suppressed culture around something like that. It's like, don't ask, don't tell, even if it's happening. Like, we're not going to talk about it. To coming to the U.S. where it is kind of talked about, maybe still not that much then, definitely not as much then as now, and still probably suppressed here. And
it was probably because of those years up until that point of watching Oprah is why I wanted answers that only he could give.
Right.
And so a lot of the things that I was trying to find out and talk about, I was just kind of asking him, because I guess the things that I'd learned on Oprah over the years, I was using it,
applying it
on him,
right.
and trying to get whatever it was I was trying to get out of him, and the things that I was asking him, and he really,
acknowledgement in some ways. You wanted him to acknowledge,
acknowledge
what he did to you, but then also what you feel like you knew
and
he
why,
did to other people, and
why he felt like what was it for him? What was it about for him? And he wasn't able to. I don't remember getting an answer to that, because I don't even think that he understood that. I think he had said to me something about things that were done to him as a child and so forth, and I think he talked to me about some of what had happened within his family and so forth, and his mom dying when he and his brothers were young and so forth, and a lot of things that happened as a result of his mother's death, and how they were left to fend for themselves. Because I knew him and his brothers well, because they had went to school. We all went to the same school,
right,
and through the same school system until I left. So I was familiar, and so in that moment, that conversation was the beginning of him not being a monster to me. And when I left that conversation with him, I wasn't fearful of him anymore. And it started to the story or the experience that happened between him and I wasn't just about that moment anymore, because now I was writing another chapter to that story, beginning with that conversation that I was having with him. And so that in this particular part of the chapter, I was the one who seeked him out. I was the one asking the questions,
right, and
I was the one who was in control, and that that changed a lot,
right.
In terms of who he was, and I wasn't, I didn't have to. It changed everything. Just me doing that with him.
So it's almost like, because I mean, and you can correct me, but like it sounds like you went into it with all these new experiences and really strength in a lot of ways. And again, this is when you're 18. It's not like you're still on the road, right? You're not, you're not there yet.
Right. No, I'm not there.
You're not there at all, right?
Yeah, no. Mm-hmm.
But you recognize within that conversation that you felt being empowered and having some control.
Mm-hmm.
And although he may not have talked about these other things with these other people, he was able to talk about some of the things that were traumatic to him, and so he was able to, in some sense, express vulnerability.
Yeah,
which sounds like was a moment of like vindication for you. That like, you know what, like this person that was this monster to me, that made me feel vulnerable, that made me feel out of control, isn't in control of his own shit.
Right, not at all. Mm-hmm. And it made me see him in a human. Like his humanity,
right?
In a way that I wasn't even thinking about,
right?
It was almost like it didn't even occur to me that he was a human,
right.
Because he had been something else for so long, just this ugly memory, and that was what that was, and he wasn't anything else other than that to me until that moment, where I was hearing all of these other things that were informing who he was and who he had become and so forth and all of that. And so it was eye-opening. And I felt compassion also from that conversation. And so it opened a door, I think, because of me feeling compassion for him and his story, opened a door for me to, not to hear him, and when I saw him after that, to not have it be awkward.
Right. Not feel like it, not demonize him as much as it was before.
Exactly. Because he wasn't the boogeyman anymore, so to speak, and I wasn't, that kid in that space in the way that it was. And so it was like writing a whole different chapter.
Right.
And I was able to let that moment go in a way that it had held me captive, in the way that I was reliving it, and in the way that it had tortured me. It didn't have that power anymore. More with Aman and Gary after the break. Listen, I know you've been thinking about starting a podcast, and trust me, I am tired of hearing you think about it. And this ad is too short for me to explain telepathic abilities to you. But what I will tell you is that you can do it for free and be as cheap as you are and as cheap as you want to be. And Anchor has the tools for you to do so creatively. Now, as soon as you submit, your friends can listen on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever they prefer to listen to the shit. And you can make money on a little thing called listenership. So just get to it and download the free Anchor app. Or go to anchor.fm to get started.
Like in that conversation or any subsequent conversations with him, was there a kind of a moment of like guilt within him? Was there a moment of expression of sorrow or apology to
He
you?
did apologize.
In that first conversation?
In the first conversation.
He did.
He did apologize.
And it felt genuine.
Yeah, it also felt like he was struggling within himself also to come to terms with what it meant that he had done what he had done. I could see that. I could see him struggling with all of that and not being really that. I don't think he was too far along in terms of him resolving whatever that is for him, or whatever was going on with him. Because I think it was still something that he was I could see him. He was very ashamed. And so I didn't. I thought, I don't know what I thought in terms of like I was going to go. I didn't go, like I said, at him in an aggressive way, but hearing his story and feeling what I felt from him in the moment, I just kind of felt compassion. And I didn't, feel like I wanted to beat him up. Right. Even in my questioning of him about what he did to me. Yeah. And so I just wanted, in a way, to help him, as crazy as that might sound.
Yeah, you were channeling your inner Oprah. I mean, in a lot of ways, Oprah's like your spirit animal. But no, in all seriousness, I think one of the things you expressed, kind of going into it, and maybe not necessarily mentally preparing yourself to do this, but you said you were utilizing some of the tools and lessons that you learned from watching the show. And I think a big piece of that, to your point, was understanding that you still have to have compassion, regardless of, how horrible or dehumanized or marginalized this person made you feel in those moments when you were younger. Yeah. And also when you had already gone and moved away, and like you talked about still running from your past, there was still a huge amount of presence in your life, even though he wasn't necessarily physically there. And you whether you realize it or not, and as we've talked about before, like this whole road idea, right? Like within the show that we saw, and then in your own experience, that you're going on this thing, and this particular part of it, you were able to kind of summon the biggest strengths that you were able to gain through those years of watching Oprah and those years being in a different culture of where you were able to express yourself, where you were able to have the courage to have a talk show, and as a teenager, where you were openly talking about abuse, not in the realm of like it happening over here, it happening to yourself, which is like it's just an incredible level of courage to be able to do that, even still while you're working through your adolescence and being a teenager and all the other confusion that we all go through at that age. That's pretty crazy and pretty powerful that you went through that experience and talked to this person and were able to get to a point where you felt this compassion and recognizing that this guy felt shame, he felt remorse, he apologized, but yet he still was lost in a lot of ways. And did not necessarily know what were the drivers to get him to that. Yeah, he had these traumatic experiences, right? But he, like many of us, didn't have the pieces to put together to figure out how did he get to that point where he did what he did.
Yeah, and the crazy thing is, that we became friends after that, because that conversation opened a door for me to see him as a human being. And there were other things that happened, because I, like I said, this was when I first moved back. And so I had lived there for 5-6 years before I left again. And throughout those years, he, had become a friend, not in terms of that we were hanging out and going to have drinks and, whatever. But, at one point we went to the same church. At one point we had some, we were a part of a youth, group thing and had activities that were going on. And he was, there to those things. And we talked and we hung out, he and I, with other people and so forth. And so, it just became a different thing,
dynamic,
a different dynamic. And, it was empowering for me, that this could happen. It's almost like I was living a different life, and that this person who was this thing, this monster in this first life, is a friend in the second life. And how could this happen?
Yeah, and it's the same person.
Right. It's the same person. And so it was, the first kind of, lesson I think that I had in my life where I realized that somebody who did something that was so traumatic to you could also be somebody who played another role in your life where they did something that was good for you, and that those things could exist alongside each other, or if not, but in the same life that this could be,
Right.
We started talking about this whole good guy, bad guy, same guy thing.
Right.
And he was very much an example of what that was like in my life. He was the bad guy, then he was a good guy, and then, coming down to the end of it, is the same guy.
Right.
And so, it's funny when I tell people that, I ended up being friends with one of the people who molested me as a child, and it was the most traumatic thing. And they're like, how could that even happen?
Right.
How could that even happen? But it did. It did happen.
Yeah, and part of it sounds like too is like within that moment, or within some of those moments of having those conversations, it wasn't necessarily that there was this one thing that he said or reacted to that was necessarily good, or a good behavior towards you. It was more so just recognizing and seeing this other person within him that you didn't know ever existed in the first place. Like,
Right.
Different analogy, of course, like kind of this whole karaoke thing that you experienced, where all of a sudden you were kind of looking and seeing something that was genuine, that was truly who you were, that you weren't expecting to see out of it, right?
Right.
So like almost in this conversation with him, it's the same type of deal. Like you went into it, you wanted answers, you got off that plane, you were marching to that basketball court to confront him, and that experience actually ended up being, not necessarily what you expected. You may not have known what you expected, but it sounds like it was very much like a, seeing him in this like vulnerable state was almost that good part, even though it's like it wasn't a direct goodness,
right,
so to speak.
Yeah, and life is complicated. It is complex. It is complicated. I think again, this whole Michael Jackson story and everything that has happened within and outside of that kind of highlights, for me personally, what I feel and informs what I feel about that whole documentary because of this personal story that I have.
Right.
And interestingly enough, somebody who had watched it also had called me and asked me what I thought about it, and I said, what the interesting thing is that I watched it and I believe absolutely that what those men said happened. But at the same time, it doesn't make me feel necessarily different about Michael Jackson than I felt before I watched the documentary. And that's because I think for me personally, I am able to, I know that two truths can exist alongside each other, that you could have somebody who is capable of amazing things, and then alongside of that, they could be capable of doing some things that could completely be destructive to somebody else's life. And again, life is complex. It's like, what do you do with it? And forget about Michael Jackson. What do you do when it's your uncle, when it's your aunt, when it's somebody in your own life who you can't, quote unquote, cancel?
Right.
Right. Because what it would mean to cancel them would be to cancel you. You have this whole history with them.
Right.
That doesn't cease to exist because of this incident, or it doesn't cease to affect you.
Yeah.
And that's the good and the bad, all of it. It's intertwined. It's messy.
Yep.
And I don't know if there is any untangling.
Right.
Because how do you untangle that history?
Right.
Right. And all, I don't know how you do that. I think you bring whatever you honestly feel about all of the different parts of it, as much of a roller coaster ride as that is, and then you take that journey.
Yeah. And
it's not easy. That's for sure. But what are you gonna do?
Yeah, and I think we touched on this a little bit before, whether it was, I can't remember if it was the previous podcast or just sitting on the couch downstairs, but
right.
It's also about the ripple effect, right? Because these experiences that happen to us as individuals also shape our experiences with other people, with people that we come across on a daily basis that we have many interactions with, and then also people that we have very few interactions with. So I think that was something that was pretty powerful for me watching that show was, yes, these things were happening between allegedly whatever.
Right.
That part means less to me than just the overall effect of experiences like this. But these things were happening to these kids. But also there were the things that were happening to the people that were around them, their family members. Yeah. There's the guy from Australia, like his family was torn apart. I mean,
you could see the pain and hear it, And
his brother, like, talking about what happened with his dad and, feeling abandoned by his mom, his sister feeling kind of, at the time, like, yeah, I definitely want to go to America, and not recognizing that, like, in that moment that that her dad was saying goodbye to her, and like her grandparents were there, that was like the last time they were together. Yeah. Not kind of digesting that and realizing that at the time. And I think that's also kind of the duplicity that happens within us, right? Like, we as people. And, you know, one of the things you asked of me was like this whole, can you think of an experience of a specific experience about a good guy, bad guy, same guy, whether it was someone in your life, yourself, whatever it may be. And I think what I kind of came to was that realization that there's so many times that as individuals, we will do something in the moment, and then we look back and be like, that wasn't me.
Right.
Like, I can't believe I did that. You know, like, what was I thinking? You know, like, and you always kind of have this retrospective, like, if I could do it again, I would have done it differently. But the reality is you can't go back. You know, you can't change it. And, you know, we are not computers. Right. You know, and even computers don't always operate at optimal speeds and whatever they're supposed to do. No matter how much you try to put the programming in and make it perfect, it isn't going to be perfect. And we don't have the ability to program ourselves in that sense yet, right? So to kind of go through life and think that no matter how educated you are, no matter how trained you are, no matter how disciplined you are or compassionate or considerate, there are going to be moments where you are going to make terrible decisions. You are going to say things to people that you probably shouldn't say to them. You're going to hurt people, whether it's through your actions, through your words, through your non-actions.
Right.
And in the moment, sometimes you're being pushed by certain emotions. Sometimes you're not. Sometimes they're lack of sleep, whatever it may be. It leads you to those moments. And it's just something that's a reality of us. We are flawed. I mean, we're not going to be perfect. No matter how ready we are. It's interesting. I was in a conversation not too long ago with, you know, a former homicide detective and a former FBI agent, so to speak. And one of the things they were talking about was, you know, the importance of training, the importance of making sure people are aware of what to do in these highly traumatic, highly dangerous situations, and that the more you're trained, the more you're capable of dealing with it. And on one side, one of the gentlemen was saying, it was like, listen, I don't care how trained you are. There could be a moment that you get triggered into something and you got to react, and you may not be able to, you will forget your training. Right. And no matter what, we are going to have these situations where, yes, we might think we're 100% and fully prepared for them, and we're going to do the right thing. But the reality is there's going to be times where you can't do it. Yeah. You know, you are frozen, you know, I don't think that makes you a bad person, right? Like, kind of like you talked about, that good guy, bad guy, same guy. It just means that
you're human.
You are human, and, you know, you're not going to always operate at the most optimal level, or, you know, kind of what you perceive yourself to be, what you perceive your identity to be.
I really feel bad for, well, you know, for lack of a better word, for Wade's mom, because I feel like she is carrying a tremendous amount of guilt, as I'm sure the other mother is as well. But for her, something about her in particular, I think I wonder if she's going to survive, you know, because the way she's wearing the pain of everything, my heart just kind of goes out to her. You know, and that's the thing where everybody kind of deals with things and carries things differently. And I know with her family, the reaction that they had, the hatred that they had for her, because of what she allowed to happen. But I think if you any of us who've had difficult relationships with our parents and I know for me particular, I was able to forgive a lot of what happened to me as a child, because when I got to know my parents as individuals and not just as my parents, right? You start to see them in a different light, and you start to understand them more as human beings and not just your parents.
Right.
And I think that opens the door for compassion and forgiveness, and to not hold them to this impossible standard that you did. And it changes, I think, your relationship with them and how you approach them and everything. And so I hope that he's able to get to that point with his mother as to understanding where and who she was, where she was in her life. Yeah. And what she wanted and what she desired and what she feared. Yeah. That might have informed how she got in that situation where she allowed that to happen the way it did.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that was really interesting to me was like, in all of the conversations around this, abuse is like there's kind of this stage of, I don't remember if it wasn't necessarily seduction, but this conditioning, this preparation for it, right? Right. And a very interesting point that, I think it was Wade who made it was the conditioning had started before they ever met him, because he was this figure that was larger than life, that was on television, that came from another planet in a lot of ways, right? America is another planet than Australia probably at that point. I mean, just like Australia is another planet to me. I've never been there. Like, I have no idea what it's like. Right. But you're kind of being brought into this experience, and you're idolizing this experience even before there was even this other interaction. And then on top of that, the way that he was kind of, manipulating the situation and kind of building these walls in between them. In one hand, giving these distractions and these tickets and these amazing hotel rooms and tours and access to these celebrities for the parents. But then on the other hand, kind of creating this me and you versus the world narrative with these young men, where they don't really know anything better on either side of it. And like they talked about a lot in even the Oprah show, like, you don't recognize what's happening to you as abuse. Right. Until you're much older. And even still, you can even see within even the other gentleman, like, there's this like guilt, like that. There's this betrayal. Like I feel like I'm letting Michael down. Like there's still like this true love, because it had been built up so strongly. And I don't necessarily look at any individual that may feel that way as weak. Right. I don't look at them as broken. I look at them as I look at all of us. We are flawed, man. Yeah. We are not necessarily flawed, but we are complicated. It's a very gray experience that we go through in this life. It's not as I think
rainbows and right. I think people also forget what it's like to be a child. Yeah. Somebody had commented that they were old enough to know right from wrong, and I was thinking that those kind of comments kind of irritate me, because to me it's people still trying to place the burden on children to not find themselves in situations where they're going to be molested. Right. And it's just disgusting. Right. But
you're still defining what you don't even have any clue of what's, like you have to be reminded to wash your hands after you use the bathroom when you're that age. You have to be reminded to brush your teeth. Like you don't know the difference between eating or drinking sour milk and regular milk. Right. Like you don't. That's something that you're still developing that stuff. You have no clue.
And I was just thinking for myself. I remember, again, moving to New York at that age and just feeling how scary the world looked to me at that time. And I had to do a lot of things on my own, like, walk to school and stuff because my mother had to do what she was doing, walk to the bus stop and stuff like that. And because of the environment that I was in, it was a very scary place. You hear gunshots, you hear, that kind of stuff. And so I remember that fear of feeling like I was going to be swallowed up by the world, the scary world that I was in.
Right.
And so, I think people forget that the world can be a very scary place for a child, and that, they depend on adults to protect them and not take advantage of them and so forth. And it's easy to say as an adult, and negate their experience as children, that, you should have, why were you there? Why did you go back? All of these things. And it's like, you're asking those questions as an adult, but you're not thinking like a child.
Right.
Right.
Because especially as a child, like, your world is so small.
We'll be right back after these messages. Have you ever thought about starting your own podcast? When I was trying to get this podcast off the ground, I had so many questions. Like, how do I record an episode? Where do I find background music? How do I get to show my podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and all the other places people like to listen? And where do I find advertisers? The answer to every one of those questions is really simple. Anchor. Anchor is the one-stop shop for recording, hosting, distributing, and monetizing your podcast. And best of all, it's 100% free and 100% ridiculously easy to use. Personally, I like that Anchor allows me to focus on being creative while they handle all the less interesting details about producing a podcast. So if you've always wanted to start a podcast, go to anchor.fm/start to join me and the diverse community of podcasters already using Anchor. That's anchor.fm/start. I can't wait to hear your podcast.
You talked about being in New York and feeling that sense of being swallowed. Like, you still, like, you're in the interactions with the people that you truly knew, like people's names that you knew, is a very small world. It's a very small place.
Yeah.
And at the ages that these kids were talking about, these now adults were talking about it, as a 7 and 8, 9-year-old, like, if Michael Jackson is like is an iconic figure, and then you also like have your parents, and then you may or may not have other friends in your life or family members, like, that's it. There's no other, you're not old enough to have experienced anything else beyond that.
Right.
It's kind of like, I remember just going from, being in a city that was relatively small, but feeling like it was the biggest place in the world, to moving out of the Boston area to going to college and like being exposed to all these other people, and then going to internships, and then since then traveling a lot. Mm-hmm. Like, the world becomes a lot bigger very quickly. With that age, like, the world is tiny, and every little piece of it, it's amplified, and I think part of like going through those experiences at that age, like, it's impossible to be able to say that narrative of like, why didn't you know, it's a very ignorant kind of thing to say, in my opinion. Just like we talked about, like, making these decisions that at the time, or in retrospect, you're like, I would have never done that, but you did.
People also to put molestation in a box, meaning it has to be this or this or the other. Or also to that it's something to that if it's not painful, there's no physical effects of it, it's not really a big deal. Whereas it's not always like that. It's, as you suffer in documentary and stuff, as kids and stuff, or if you enjoy it, it's not real.
Right.
Like, it was a real molestation.
So if a kid is going through molestation and it's their first time being sexualized, and it's something that feels good, that feel good because your body's reacting and all that stuff, it can be bad.
Right.
Because your body's reacting, things are happening. So as a child, you don't know what that means, especially if it's the first time or whatever.
Wade said that. Mm-hmm.
So you don't know what to do with that. So you're like, well, this feels good as a 5, 6, 7-year-old child, which you're not supposed to have those experiences.
Right.
So as the documentary talked about, the boy was talking about how he looked forward to visiting Michael Jackson, but also he looked forward to the experiences because at a year or two younger, he had become sexualized.
Right.
So it's part of the dynamic too that people don't understand because they're like, well, you can't have gone through that if you've enjoyed it, if you wait and you want to go back for that again. Right. So people have that feeling that it's something that it's not real, or you're putting yourself in a situation for this because you want to do it. Right. And as a child, your mental capacity is not even 5, 6, 7, 8 years old. What kind of capacity can you have to really comprehend the situation?
Right.
I think that's one of the reasons. To what your point, I think that's one of the reasons why Oprah said that this word sex abuse has people twisted, because when they think about abuse, they're thinking about it has to be some violent rape that you got to look like you've been beaten.
Right. And the kid is screaming and it's horrible and they hate it and they don't like it.
Right. And she said that's why we need to rebrand it as sexual seduction, because then that is a different kind of thing. It's something that you there was pleasure, and if there's pleasure,
Right. I remember when she did the 100 Men show, and some of the men talked about that, and they were she brought it up. I don't know where my voice is going. She talked about it, and some of the guys who were 30, 40, 50 years old talked about it, how they were ashamed that they enjoyed the experience as a child, and they couldn't wrap their head around, as a child, this thing happened to me, and part of me enjoyed this, and they're trying to understand, how is this even possible? Right, exactly. And that kind of creates a whole...
And the guilt.
Right.
That they carried.
Right. And that's why I'm not telling you about it, because this happened over and over, and I went... This happened, so it's my fault because I went and I allowed this, as opposed to if somebody's raped, and so it's easiest for the point to understand of rape because visually you're seeing something that is forced, and you can kind of rationalize. But if somebody's being molested over and over, people kind of they can't wrap their minds around that, because it's like, okay, it happened to you once, you didn't say anything about it, and you went back to this place, you allowed this to happen to you, so it's part of it's your fault. Right.
The blame. We as a society like to have the scapegoat or the one thing to point at and blame. Right. It was either the parent's fault or the abuser's fault or the one that was abused fault. Right. But guess what? We can't put things into boxes like you talked about. We have to get a deeper understanding of these things and recognize that, like, they aren't happening in a vacuum. Like, it's all part of a bigger process. They talked a lot about in that show, like, the grooming process of it, the building of the trust, and the building of this is our secret, and if anybody else finds out about it, like, we're both going to be in big, big trouble. And like, as a kid, the thought of trouble is like mortifying. I mean, I remember being a kid and like, if I got in trouble, like, it was the worst thing ever. Right. And now it's like trouble, like.
But the other thing I think that the missing piece to what Gary was articulating is that they don't consider what it does to your soul. They're focusing on physical things, but they're not talking about the spiritual aspect of how you're like, I think one of the guys said it, that you're murdering these children's spirits when you interfere with them that way, and that is not that's harder for people to quantify. They can't put their finger on that. What does that even look like? Well, this is what it looks like. That's what they're trying to show you, that it looks like a father who is having trouble bonding with his son and his wife as an adult because this thing happened to him when he was 8, 9, 10. You know, this is how it materializes. The way he functions and moves into the world is affected by this thing that happened. And unless he's able to go through the hard work of healing that wound, is gonna, you know, it's gonna, he's either gonna be somebody that's crippled by it or he's going to be empowered by it. But he has to take that journey from one space to the other.
And again, I mean, it kind of goes back to what I was saying before. Some days he could probably feel empowered, and some days he can feel completely crippled.
And he could feel all of that at the same time.
At the same time,
yeah,
right.
You know?
So it's a very interesting experience, kind of listening to that or watching the 2 parts, and then kind of watching the after show with Oprah, and it was powerful for sure. And I, when you asked me to be a part of this, I mean, I was humbled. One, because I recognized the weight of it.
Yeah,
it's not an easy thing to talk about, but then just the added layer of like, this is something that you've experienced, I mean, and for someone who hasn't experienced anything like this, it always like, you always are kind of the outsider looking at it, and you're like, oh my gosh, this is so crazy and heinous, and you want to start to like extrapolate. Like to Gary's point, you're thinking about just the physical act of it, as opposed to like the bigger picture around it, which is like the emotional effect, the ripple effect to the family members, the ripple effect to the people that you would come across in your life, and how it shapes you, and how it took you until you kind of did this karaoke thing to truly see like something within you that was genuinely probably hidden the whole time, but it was your true self, and how that was able to ladder up to the ability to submit the other video that actually ultimately got you on the show, which laddered up to this other piece of going on it again, going to Australia, and experiencing this other thing for you, that you were able to kind of have this rebirth. And now, it's coming to this culmination where you're able to kind of not in particular share this story, but have this platform within this podcast to talk about these conversations and to really open up, not just my ability to talk about these things that are not popular or not easy to talk about, but it allows me to talk about it and share it, and for other people to hear it and kind of pass that message forward. Like, oh wow, did you check this thing out? Maybe you should listen to this. Or, I was feeling really down about this, and what gave me strength was, my roommate who's gone through something crazier nothing that I could even ever relate to, but has been able to kind of turn it into a positive and turn it into an inspiring thing. And it's just that ability to kind of pass it forward, and in a lot of ways, I mean, that's what Oprah's about, right? That's
important. Like with that point that you just made, if more people would just come to things that they don't understand with a willingness to hear what other people have to say without them trying to, make it what they think it should be, or what they want it to be. I mean, it would make a big difference, because a lot of people don't talk and don't share because there's not a space for them to be really authentically heard. Because people don't show up with open hearts and open minds. They show up with their judgments and their condemnation and their preconceived ideas that they can't let go.
Right.
And so I think that a lot of people have to take their own personal responsibility as to why things play out the way they do in their own lives and their own family.
Yeah.
And who did you give the space to share? And if they didn't, why didn't they?
Right.
All of those things.
For sure.
One of the things I want to end with as we kind of wrap things up is I came into this documentary with the question of whether or not Oprah's intention for doing the show would be met, because there would be so much noise I felt surrounding this figure that's larger than life, Michael Jackson, and the noise surrounding whether or not people would be able to hear the message of what the documentary was really about. And, I came away with it feeling like, absolutely it was worth it. Because for me, personally, I saw, and I wasn't expecting to see, so much of my own growth and process of how I came from one space with my abuse to the other through the story that these guys were able to share.
Right.
And I think the documentary did a brilliant job of taking you through the trajectory of that pain, and how it can materialize and what it actually looks like when it affects you in on so much levels,
Right.
and what it looks like when your soul has been murdered, so to speak,
Right.
in that way as a child, and what you have to deal with it, the wreckage of it, as an adult. And so what do you guys think in terms of that, as far as the going into it and whether or not her intention was met for?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've probably, I've heard it in my office and other places where it's like, people are like, oh, did you see the documentary? And it's like, do you think he did it or not? And it's like, guess what? That part doesn't matter to me as much as just understanding the bigger picture of this issue that is within our society that, where you grew up was a very much behind closed doors, wasn't talked about, and still is in a lot of ways even here today in our more open society.
Right.
But I think my biggest takeaway from it was that it's a lot more complex than people think it is, and it is also something that is a shared experience for people, and it's important to give people the platform to talk about it. And if having a documentary about if it needed to come from this vehicle that's Michael Jackson that everybody knows about and everybody can say, oh, I've heard his music, and in order to get it and raise it to that stage because it's connected to him, if it allows for these bigger conversations for other people, to inspire other people, to allow Oprah to kind of use it as a stage to do it, and has been doing it throughout all these years, that to me is the lesson. It isn't, I don't give a shit as much about his estate or whether or not he did it or whether or not I should cancel his music and not listen to his music. What I care about is the fact that it allows people to be inspired to recognize that this is happening, and to hopefully, empower people to stop it earlier on in situations when they're able to kind of recognize it and see it, whether it's when it's happening to somebody. I think that was something that was a big piece for me. And, one thing that we touched on before, that we haven't necessarily touched on yet in this was, you got to also think about the context of the time when this kind of allegations were coming out. It was early 90s. There was this very, blatant look at Black society and being kind of under attack, right? Rodney King situation, Michael Jackson, O.J. Simpson, and you were kind of forced to be dropped on these two different sides of the fence. It's like, oh, they're coming after our heroes, right?
Right.
Like, O.J., there's no way O.J. did that. Like, but in retrospect, it's like, man, he probably did that,
right.
But there was this like blind allegiance, to our culture, and like, so that's what I think. Fast forward to now, when people who I idolize Michael, Black culture, white culture, whatever it may be, like idolized him as this incredible entertainer and like person. It's really hard for a lot of people to just like stop looking at that particular piece of it, that it's Michael, and really start to look at the overall concept of abuse and molestation and like the seduction and the process and the things that it does to people and how it affects all of us, right? Because even though I may not have gone through that experience, like having these conversations with you has affected me. It's allowed me to feel more comfortable talking about my vulnerabilities, talking about mental health issues, and being able to step up and be on the original episode that we had a while back. Because admittedly, like I'm not even big into podcasts necessarily. Like my best friend, when I first told him I was on this, he was shocked because he's been trying to get me to listen to podcasts for a while. So I'm like, I want anything to do with him. And he was like, he could not believe it. I mean, he's going to listen to this and he's going to be dying laughing. But
so you went from you can't even listen to podcasts, now you're on a podcast.
Right. Now I'm on a podcast. So I think I think that's one of the lessons that you kind of take away from these things is like, forget about whether you think this icon that everybody can relate to and has affected their lives in one way or another from a music and entertainment standpoint did or didn't do it. Think about why the dialogue around the bigger topic allows us as individuals to take a better look at our own society, take a better look at the darker things that happen, the horrible things that happen, not necessarily darker, I don't want to say that, but like horrible, terrible things that we want to pretend like we try to kind of push into these boxes, right? Like, oh yeah, molestation, oh yeah, racism, bigotry, homophobia. Like, let's that's out there, but let's just not talk about them, right?
Right.
These are the things that kind of force these conversations to happen, and that to me is the most powerful piece. It's the catalyst that allows for better open dialogue to truly address the wounds that are happening in our society today and not just continue to push them under the rug.
Oprah would be so proud of you.
Well, I was trying to reclaim my time, but he took it all from me. For me personally, I mean, I did not want to watch this documentary. It was going back to tell you we're talking about regarding Michael Jackson and stuff. I just didn't want to deal with the whole situation. I already had heard about these guys years ago, about the allegations and stuff, and these were the guys who were saying nothing happened and then it came back, and I was like, so I'd heard that pre-notion of the story, so I was like, okay, and then I was like, okay, it's going to be it's like part 1 and part 2. I'm like, God.
I said the same thing, by the way. I was like, I'll watch it, and it was like, it's 4 hours.
I was like, no, I got to put my mind into this if I really want to watch this. But, I mean, seeing how they did the story and how they kind of, if people are really looking at it and trying to not try to be objective, I guess, which is kind of hard to do, because you talk about being Michael Jackson's involved as opposed to somebody who's been accused of child molestation and you have no association with. So it's harder to do it with him. So you could see the paths of what they were talking about and how their love for him and the whole situation and how it was easy for them to get brought in. I'm not going to go into the whole documentary, but the focus, again, as people talked about, is kind of talking about the topic of molestation and how it happens and how you can see a path, whether or not you believe the Michael Jackson situation. What they talked about kind of fits the mold of what happens to people.
The seduction.
Right, and the grooming and all that kind of stuff. Those are patterns that happen in a lot of situations, but not in all cases, but the pattern of grooming that happens in a lot of situations. So it kind of shows you how, again, going back to the situation too, where these were not quote-unquote violent situations. These children, even after situations happened again, they wanted to be back into this person's path. They wanted to be into their lives. They wanted to kind of have those intimate experiences. So those things are effects of molestation on somebody on a young age, and how you become, as I said, sexualized at that age, and something becomes awakened in your body. You don't know these first-time feelings, and it's a rush. It's a feeling, something that you enjoy, and you want it again. You can't close the box. It's already happened.
Like
right.
a moth to a flame.
Right. So when people talk about these kind of things, and they're like, well, with kids, it's like, why didn't you say anything? And I think people don't understand when people ask kids about these things, and then kids are not saying, "Oh, yes, it happened to me." People have a hard time understanding why would somebody say, "No, this didn't happen to me," and it did, because they're protecting the abuser, and that in itself is a whole
psychology of
right.
it.
It's a whole nother realm of it. Because people who haven't experienced it, they don't understand it, especially if something happened to a family member too. Because you think about the not wanting to break up the family, the things that happen, and all that kind of stuff. So, as a child, all that weight is coming on you because you're thinking that you don't want to cause trouble. Mm-hmm. You want to
please.
You don't want to create anything that's going to cause any confusion. So, it's better to say nothing happened than to deal with the effects of what did happen, because you're in your mind you're thinking, if I say it happened, it's going to open all these doors, it's going to create all these people are going to like me, my family's going to hate me. As a child, all those different things come to you, and you want to not deal with it. So from that point of view, and from the point of view of what Oprah talked about and situation, I think from her point of view, she's dealt with it before and she's gone through, so she knows the patterns, she's seen things and the things that they talked about. And I think she kind of relates to a lot of things that they talked about too. And she can tell whether or not people are, I think it's kind of hard to kind of coach molestation, if that makes any sense. Coach your effects of molestation. You can create a story for molestation, but I think to be articulate in the depth of talking about something happening to you, if you're making something like that up, you have to really, really go through a lot to really make something that depth and the emotion of it all. That's a lot of stuff to go through. You're really a great actor, a really calculating person.
I think that's what because like I said, I watched it with a healthy bit of skepticism, but towards this part 2, and then the Oprah part really brought it home for me, because I started to see more of their pain.
Right.
And that pain is so acute and it's so raw.
Yeah.
Especially from I can't remember the other guy's name, not Wade, but the other guy. His pain
Jimmy.
is
I think his name was Jimmy.
Jimmy, yeah. His pain is so right there on the surface that you could touch it, and the way was affected by it, it's still, so visible and so visceral. Yeah. And so it was just kind of like undeniable. And it's like, no, you can't make that, and even somebody who I spoke with who doubted it, he said, but I believe something happened to them because you could see it.
Right.
I don't know if Michael Jackson did it though, but something happened to them,
Yeah.
And that's for a lot of people, that's what they're wrestling with. It's like, oh my God, I can't believe that Michael Jackson would do this, but gosh, something happened to them though.
Right.
Something happened. Like, what happened? And it's kind of like when like you have experience with somebody, they say, well, listen, I don't know that person to be like that. And it's like, okay, well, you're not the person that had the experience with them, but people have a hard time having those parallel truths existing. It's like they can't have. He either has to be a great musician or a child molester. He can't be both. Why not?
Right.
Why can't he?
Right.
Because in our own personal lives, if we take Michael Jackson out of it and we look at people in our own lives, our own family, well, okay, that uncle that molested you, he was loved. Everybody loved him, but he still molested you. Those two things are true. And the things that you love about him, they're true too. And that's why you love him, right? Mm-hmm. And so the things that you hate about him, that's true too. And that's why you hate him. And you love him and you hate him for the same reasons that the same things that he is, again, good guy, bad guy, same guy. And for these guys, that guy is Michael Jackson.
And I also kind of feel like it's a very surface level reaction to things.
Yeah.
Like, you just want to make the decision of I'm either going to listen to him or I'm not, instead of like taking that next step of like, recognizing that it's beyond just this individual. It's something that's part of our overall makeup as a society of like continuing to move on from the bad things as quickly as possible instead of like continuing to have the conversations around them so that we heal and you can inspire because, you know, believe it or not, you were 11 years old and you were watching Oprah for the first time, but then when you actually became part of that experience as 18 years later, guess what? There were people watching you, you know, and there were people being inspired by you. And that's why it's important to continue to, as painful as it is to try to think about these things and hear about these things and maybe decide one way or the other if you believe it happened or not by this particular individual. Who cares? I mean, at that point, as long as people are being inspired to feel empowered and to learn and to want to talk about it, I think that's the biggest lesson.
And we'll end it right there. You guys did really good. Thank you.
Thank you, Akil.
Thank you,
Oprah Jr.
Boys. I'm Akil Johnson, the poet god. Thank you for listening.